Richard Hale had built an empire that powered half the Western Hemisphere's defense systems, convinced that his brilliance made him untouchable and everyone else expendable. But when Sentinel collapsed in 12 catastrophic minutes, erasing $18 billion and branding him a national security threat, the only person who didn't abandon him was the maid who cleaned his penthouse before dawn. And when Rachel's daughter Mara, carrying a second-hand laptop covered in coding stickers, offered to examine his ruined systems, Richard nearly laughed because what could a 19-year-old possibly see that his billion-dollar analysts had missed? But there was something the fallen billionaire didn't understand about the quiet girl standing in his debris-filled penthouse. She wasn't just good with computers, she was the only person alive who could trace the sabotage back to the one man Richard had trusted above all others. And the truth she was about to uncover would either resurrect his empire or bury him forever. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to know, have you ever watched someone powerful lose everything overnight? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if stories about redemption and hidden strength resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed. Richard Hale stood in the heart of Hale Dynamics Command Center, surrounded by a wall of screens displaying Sentinel's live performance metrics. His reflection flickered across the dark glass, sharp jaw set in confidence, tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, eyes that had stared down senators and generals without flinching. Beyond the reinforced windows, his headquarters rose like a steel monument above a city that whispered his name in boardrooms and Pentagon briefings. He touched the edge of the nearest screen, watching predictive algorithms dance across defense scenarios. This was his kingdom. Built not with inherited wealth or lucky breaks, but with pure, uncompromising intelligence. And he'd convinced himself that needing anyone, trusting anyone, was the only weakness he couldn't afford, but that revelation was still days away. Back then, before the collapse, before the betrayal, before a 19-year-old girl became the only person who could save him, Richard Hale was untouchable. The city stretched beneath him like a circuit board, glowing lines of traffic pulsing through streets he'd never walk. Richard stood at the eastern wall of his headquarters, 63 floors above the noise, the dirt, the desperation. His reflection merged with the skyline, sharp edges, calculated angles, a man built to dominate rather than bend. He checked his watch. 5:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, his executive team would assemble for the final Sentinel briefing. In 6 hours, the system would go live for its ultimate stress test. And by tomorrow morning, Hale Dynamics would be positioned at the center of national defense strategy for the next 2 decades. His phone buzzed against the glass table. He glanced at the screen, Senator Carolyn Voss, Defense Appropriations Committee. Third call this week. He swiped it away without reading the message preview. Politicians always wanted reassurance, hand-holding, validation that their investments were safe. Richard didn't deal in reassurance. He dealt in results. Behind him, the command center hummed with quiet intensity. Engineers moved between terminals, their faces lit by cascading data streams. Sentinel's architecture filled the primary display, a neural web of predictive algorithms capable of identifying threats before human analysts even knew to look. It could parse satellite imagery, intercept communications, model geopolitical scenarios across 14 variables simultaneously. It was, without exaggeration, the most powerful threat detection system ever built. And it was his. Mr. Hale. Richard turned. His chief engineer, Dr. Amara Okonkwo, stood 3 feet back, tablet clutched against her chest. She had the look of someone preparing to deliver bad news, shoulders tight, jaw set, eyes already braced for dismissal. The briefing starts in 11 minutes, Richard said flatly. Whatever this is, it can wait. Sir, it can't. Amara stepped closer, lowering her voice. We're still seeing irregularities in Sentinel's decision tree. The same patterns from last week. Someone's been accessing the core parameters. We discussed this. Richard's tone dropped 10 degrees. Your team ran 3 separate audits. You found nothing. We found evidence of access, Amara corrected carefully. We just couldn't trace it to a specific user. But the modifications are there, Mr. Hale. Small changes to threat weighting protocols, adjustment to confidence thresholds. Small changes that your own analysis confirmed were within acceptable variance. Acceptable doesn't mean intentional, Amara pressed. If someone inside the company is altering, then find them. Richard cut her off with surgical precision. You have the best cybersecurity team in the industry. You have unlimited resources. You have my full authorization to investigate. But what you don't have is permission to delay this launch based on paranoia. Amara's jaw tightened. It's not paranoia when the anomalies are documented. It's paranoia when you can't prove malice. Richard stepped past her toward the conference room. We go live in 6 hours. I suggest you focus on making sure Sentinel performs flawlessly instead of chasing ghosts in the logs. He didn't wait for her response. Leaders didn't linger in doubt. They decided, they executed, they moved forward. Hesitation was for people who feared consequences more than they valued success. The executive briefing lasted 42 minutes. Richard outlined the test parameters with clinical efficiency, full-spectrum simulation, real-world data integration, live monitoring by Pentagon observers. His VP of Operations asked about contingency protocols. His general counsel raised concerns about liability exposure if anything went wrong during federal observation. Richard dismissed both with the same answer: nothing would go wrong. Sentinel had been tested in isolated environments for 18 months. Every subsystem had been stress-tested beyond operational limits. This final evaluation was a formality, a performance for the stakeholders who needed to see the system prove itself before signing contracts worth $30 billion. Any other questions? Richard scanned the room. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that came from people who'd learned that challenging Richard Hale meant being replaced. Good. We begin at noon. I want all department heads in the command center by 11:30. He closed his portfolio. Dismissed. They filed out quietly, whispering to each other in clusters. Richard remained seated, alone in the glass-walled room, watching his city wake up beneath him. Somewhere down there, people were worried about mortgages, medical bills, whether their kids would get into decent schools. Richard had left those concerns behind decades ago. He'd climbed out of that world through intelligence, through ruthlessness, through refusing to accept limitations other people called reality. And he'd never looked back. He returned to his penthouse at 6:15 a.m. The private elevator opened directly into his foyer, white marble, minimalist furniture, art that cost more than most people earned in a year. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. Except for the sound of movement in the kitchen. Richard frowned. He'd specifically instructed his assistant not to schedule any. Oh. A soft voice, startled. Mr. Hale. I'm sorry, I thought you'd still be at the office. Rachel emerged from the hallway, cleaning supplies in hand, a worn cross glinting at her collar. She was small, mid-50s, with tired eyes and hands that had seen too much work. She'd been cleaning his penthouse for nearly 5 years. Richard knew her name because it was on the service contract. He knew almost nothing else. You're early, he said, not quite a question, not quite an accusation. Yes, sir. I had to adjust my schedule this week. My daughter, she stopped herself, shaking her head. I'll be out of your way in 20 minutes. Richard nodded once and moved past her toward his bedroom. He didn't ask about her daughter. He didn't ask why her schedule had changed. Those details belonged to a life that had nothing to do with his. Rachel understood that. She always had. That's why she'd lasted 5 years when most of his household staff turned over within 18 months. She didn't intrude. She didn't ask questions. She simply cleaned, quietly and thoroughly, and then disappeared. Exactly the way Richard preferred. By 11:20 a.m., the command center was packed. Engineers at every terminal. Military liaisons positioned along the back wall. Richard's executive team clustered near the primary display. And in the corner, behind reinforced glass, 3 Pentagon observers sat with tablets and secure phones, ready to report back to the generals who would ultimately decide Sentinel's fate. Richard stood at the center of it all, hands clasped behind his back, watching the countdown clock tick toward noon. All systems green, someone called out. Data feed synchronized, another voice confirmed. Amara appeared at his shoulder, her expression still tight with unspoken concern. Sir, I'm formally recommending we delay by 72 hours. Just long enough to. No. Mr. Hale. We've had this conversation, Dr. Okonkwo. Richard didn't look at her. Either you trust your work, or you don't. If you don't, I'll find someone who does. Amara went silent. Not because she agreed. Because she understood the threat. The clock hit 12 hours. Sentinel is live, the lead systems operator announced. Full operational mode engaged. The room held its breath. For 30 seconds, everything was perfect. Data streams flowed smoothly. Predictive models spun up without hesitation. Threat assessments populated across the display in real time, color-coded and prioritized exactly as designed. Richard allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. This was what excellence looked like. This was what happened when you refused to compromise. Then someone gasped. Wait, a junior analyst leaned forward, squinting at her screen. Why is the confidence threshold dropping? Confirming anomaly, another engineer called out. Decision tree it's rewriting itself. Amara was already moving, her fingers flying across a tablet. I'm seeing unauthorized parameter changes. Active changes. Happening right now. Shut it down, Richard snapped. We're trying. I said shut it down. But Sentinel wasn't listening anymore. Across the wall of displays, data streams began corrupting. Classification protocols inverted. Threat models collapsed into nonsensical loops. And then, silently, almost elegantly, a single line of code executed deep in the system's core, a command that had been waiting, dormant, for exactly this moment. A sabotage command. No alarms. No warnings. Just a quiet, catastrophic unraveling that would erase $18 billion in 12 minutes. And somewhere, in a location Richard would later learn was untraceable, an encrypted alert pinged across a secured network. Sentinel compromised. Phase 1 complete. Richard stared at the screens, watching his empire begin to collapse, and felt the first cold whisper of something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Fear. Have you ever watched something you built start to crumble in real time, knowing you can't stop it? We'll return to Richard's catastrophic night in just a moment, but the worst was still ahead. By 7 p.m., Richard had transformed his penthouse into a theater of confidence. Crystal glasses caught the light from the city below. Servers moved silently between clusters of power, senators, defense contractors, military brass with enough stars on their shoulders to invade a small country. Richard worked the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, projecting the unshakable certainty that had made him a legend in circles where legends didn't come easy. Sentinel's performance today was flawless, he told Senator Voss, handing her a fresh bourbon. Your colleagues at the Pentagon are already drafting the contracts. She smiled, but her eyes held questions. I heard there were some technical hiccups during the stress test. Minor calibrations, Richard said smoothly. Nothing that affected core functionality. That's why we run tests, to identify and correct variables before full deployment. It was a lie. A clean, professional lie. The kind Richard had perfected over 2 decades of turning setbacks into narratives of control. The truth was uglier. Sentinel hadn't just hiccuped during the noon test, it had convulsed. Amara and her team had spent 6 hours isolating the anomalies, tracing the cascade of corrupted logic that had nearly crashed the entire system in front of Pentagon observers. They'd managed to stabilize it just long enough to present acceptable data, to make it look like the problems were containable. Richard had dismissed the engineers at 5:30 p.m. with a single instruction: fix it by morning. Now, surrounded by people whose signatures could authorize $30 billion, he played the only role that mattered, the man who had everything under control. But 63 floors below, in the command center he'd emptied for appearances, Sentinel was about to prove him catastrophically wrong. What happened next erased $18 billion in 12 minutes, and none of the powerful people sipping champagne in Richard's penthouse saw it coming. At 8:43 p.m., Sentinel's automated monitoring system triggered its final full-scale evaluation protocol. It was supposed to be a background process, a silent health check running diagnostic sweeps across every subsystem. Standard procedure. Routine maintenance. Except someone had rewritten what routine meant. In the command center, a single workstation still displayed Sentinel's core architecture. The screen flickered. Then again. A junior systems analyst, working late to implement Amara's emergency patches, leaned closer. That's not right. Files began corrupting. Not randomly. Systematically. Classification algorithms rewrote themselves into recursive loops that spiraled into nonsense. Threat assessment protocols inverted their own logic, flagging allied assets as hostile, dismissing genuine risks as statistical noise. And deep in the kernel, where the system's fundamental decision-making lived, core components started cannibalizing their own code. The analyst grabbed his phone, hands shaking. Dr. Okonkwo. We have a problem. A big problem. Within 90 seconds, Amara was sprinting through the building's marble lobby, security badge flapping against her chest. She hit the command center at a dead run, her worst fears crystallizing into horrifying reality on the screens before her. Pull the plug, she ordered. Hard shutdown. Now. We can't, the system's locked us out. Then cut the physical power. Ma'am, it's distributed across 14 server farms. We'd need authorization from. I don't care what you need. Amara's voice cracked. This thing is shredding classified defense data in real time. But it was already too late. We've all seen collapses, market crashes, failed launches, companies that crumbled under bad press. But not one like this. Not one where you could watch, line by line, as a system designed to protect an entire nation turned itself into the threat. Sentinel's corruption spread like poison through digital veins, terabytes of classified intelligence, satellite imagery, intercept transcripts, strategic assessments, began fragmenting into unrecoverable fragments. Worse, the system wasn't just destroying data. It was rewriting it. Inserting false patterns. Creating ghost threats that looked real enough to trigger military responses. And the tampering? It wasn't a glitch. It was surgical. Precise. Intentional. Every log entry, every modification, every line of corrupted code bore the unmistakable signature of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone inside Hale Dynamics. Upstairs, Richard was mid-sentence, explaining the elegance of Sentinel's threat prediction algorithms to a 3-star general, when his phone erupted with alerts. He glanced at the screen. 12 missed calls. All from Amara. His smile didn't waver. Excuse me for just a moment. He stepped into his study, closing the door. This better be. Sentinel's collapsing. Amara's voice was raw. Complete systemic failure. We're losing classified files. The Pentagon's firewall detected unauthorized data transfers. Federal agencies are already mobilizing. Shut it down. We can't. It's locked us out. Richard, this isn't a malfunction. Someone did this. Someone with root access. Richard's world tilted. How long? 11 minutes since the cascade started. But the damage, Richard, this is going to look like sabotage. Intentional sabotage. Through the study window, Richard could see his guests laughing, networking, believing they were witnessing the birth of a new era in defense technology. He turned away from them, pressing his palm against the cold glass. "Contain it," he said quietly. "Whatever you have to do. It's too late for containment. The feds are probably already." A knock at the study door. Sharp. Official. Richard opened it to find his head of security flanked by two men in dark suits, badges clipped to their belts. "Mr. Hale," one of them said, "I'm Special Agent Kellerman, FBI Cyber Division. We need you to come with us." Behind them, the party had gone silent. Senators watched with carefully neutral expressions. Military officials checked their phones, already receiving alerts from their own agencies. The theater of confidence Richard had built collapsed in seconds. On what grounds? Richard kept his voice level. "National security. Your company's systems have been flagged as compromised. We're seizing all servers, data logs, and access credentials pending investigation." Kellerman's expression was granite. "You're not under arrest. Yet. But we need you to cooperate fully." By midnight, Hale Dynamics headquarters was swarming with federal agents. Server farms shut down. Buildings locked. Every employee escorted out with warnings about obstruction of justice. By 3 a.m., the first headlines hit: defense contractor security system collapses, classified data compromised. By dawn, they'd turn vicious: Hale Dynamics, incompetence or treason. And deep in Sentinel's corrupted core, a final automated command executed silently. An encrypted alert packet, compressed and obfuscated, pinged across 17 proxy servers before landing at an IP address that didn't officially exist. The message was brief. Phase 2 initiated. Target isolated. Proceed as planned. Someone, somewhere, opened that message and smiled. Richard Hale's empire hadn't just collapsed. It had been murdered. And the killer was already moving to the next step. The interrogation room smelled like burnt coffee and institutional despair. Richard sat across from two federal agents, a lawyer he'd hired that morning to his left, and a pile of documents thick enough to bury a career. Special Agent Kellerman slid another photograph across the table, a screenshot of corrupted code, highlighted sections glowing red like evidence of a crime Richard couldn't even understand. "Walk us through your access protocols again, Mr. Hale." "I've already explained." "Explain it again." Richard's jaw tightened. He'd spent 72 hours repeating the same answers to different faces in different rooms. FBI. NSA. Defense Intelligence Agency. They all asked the same questions with the same tone, not seeking information, but building a case. "I had administrative access to Sentinel's operational dashboard," he said, forcing his voice to stay level. "I did not have direct access to core programming. That required dual authentication from myself and the chief engineer. Dr. Okonkwo." "Yes. Who you pressured to ignore security warnings the morning of the collapse." Richard's lawyer interjected. "My client made a business decision based on available data." "Your client's business decision compromised 14 months of classified intelligence." Kellerman leaned forward. "Someone with deep system access sabotaged Sentinel from the inside. Someone who knew exactly where to strike and how to cover their tracks. So either you're incompetent, Mr. Hale, or you're complicit." The words landed like punches. Richard had built his reputation on being neither. Now he was being forced to choose which failure to own. "I want immunity," Richard said quietly. His lawyer's head snapped toward him. "Richard. Not for myself." Richard kept his eyes on Kellerman. "For my engineers. Give them immunity and full cooperation agreements. They'll walk you through every line of code, every access log, every anomaly we documented. Because I'm telling you, someone sabotaged my company. And I'm going to help you find them. Kellerman studied him for a long moment. Then he gathered his files and stood. We'll be in touch. Have you ever watched everything you built vanish overnight? Not slowly, not with warning, but in the space between heartbeats, everything you worked for, everything you believed about yourself, just, gone. Richard walked out of that federal building into a world that no longer recognized him. The board meeting happened 48 hours later. Richard wasn't invited, he was summoned. The conference room that had once felt like his throne room now felt like an execution chamber. 23 board members sat around the table, their faces carefully blank. At the head sat Vice Chairman Lennox, Richard's oldest ally, the man who'd stood beside him through every acquisition, every expansion, every triumph. Lennox didn't meet his eyes. Richard, said Margaret Chen, the board secretary, her voice clinical, we're here to discuss the company's leadership in light of recent events. Recent events, Richard repeated, tasting the euphemism. You mean the federal investigation? We mean, Lennox said quietly, finally looking at him, the complete loss of investor confidence. 3 defense contracts cancelled. Stock price down 62%. And criminal liability that could bankrupt this company if the investigation finds wrongdoing. I didn't sabotage Sentinel. That may be true. Lennox folded his hands on the table. But you ignored warnings. You pushed the launch forward despite documented security concerns. And whether you're criminally liable or just negligent, the result is the same. Hale Dynamics can't survive with you at the helm. Richard felt something cold settle in his chest. You're removing me. We're protecting the company you built, Margaret said. Surely you understand. I understand that the moment things got difficult, you all became cowards. Silence. Then Lennox spoke, and his tone carried something Richard had never heard from him before, pity. The votes already happened, Richard.it was unanimous. You're out. Effective immediately. 23 people. 23 voices that had once done whatever he commanded. It took them 7 minutes to erase him. The assets froze faster than Richard could track. Bank accounts locked pending investigation. Investment portfolios seized as potential evidence. His company stock, once worth billions, now worthless paper being held by federal regulators. Even his penthouse, purchased through a corporate entity now under scrutiny, received a foreclosure notice. Richard stood in his living room 3 days after the board vote, surrounded by boxes he'd been ordered to pack. Financial statements covered every surface, red ink bleeding through pages like wounds. He tried to understand how it happened so fast. How a man worth billions on Monday could be functionally broke by Friday. The bourbon helped. Not with understanding, but with not caring that he didn't understand. He hadn't shaved since the interrogation. Hadn't changed clothes in 2 days. Hadn't answered calls from anyone, not that many people were calling anymore. Amazing how quickly a powerful man's network evaporated when the power disappeared. The penthouse felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. $70 million worth of real estate that suddenly felt like a prison. Richard poured another drink, his hand trembling slightly. When had that started? The trembling? Mr. Hale. He spun, bourbon sloshing. Rachel stood in the hallway, cleaning supplies conspicuously absent. She wore the same expression she'd worn the morning after the collapse, worried, uncertain, like she was approaching something fragile. You're not supposed to be here, Richard said, his voice rough. Building management cancelled all service contracts. I know. She took a hesitant step forward. But I still have my key card. And I thought maybe you could use some company. I don't need company. No, sir. Rachel moved to the kitchen despite his words. But maybe you need this. She emerged moments later carrying a steaming mug. The scent hit him before she spoke, ginger, honey, something else he couldn't name. The same tea she'd made the morning after Sentinel collapsed. My mom used to make this, Rachel said softly, setting it on the table near him. When the world felt too heavy. It doesn't fix anything. But it helps you remember you're still human. Richard stared at the mug. Such a small gesture. Meaningless in the scope of what he'd lost. So why did his throat suddenly feel tight? Thank you, he whispered. Rachel nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Mr. Hale. I know you don't think you need anyone right now. But, you're wrong about that. She headed toward the door, and Richard found himself speaking before he could stop himself. Why are you here, Rachel? Really? She looked back, and her eyes held something he'd never seen from her before. Not pity. Understanding. Because 5 years ago, when my husband died and I thought I'd lose our apartment, you extended my contract without me asking. You never mentioned it. Never made me feel small for needing help. You just helped. She smiled sadly. So now it's my turn. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He hadn't remembered that contract extension. Hadn't thought about it since signing the paperwork. It had been nothing, a clerical decision made between meetings. But to Rachel, it had been everything. The door clicked open. Mom. A young woman stepped inside, 19, maybe 20, with braids pulled back and sharp, intelligent eyes that swept the room, cataloging the chaos. She wore faded jeans and a hoodie, a battered laptop bag slung across her shoulder. Rachel's expression shifted, surprise mixing with maternal concern. Mara? What are you doing here? I told you to wait. You were taking too long. Mara's gaze landed on Richard, assessing him with unsettling directness. No fear. No judgment. Just curiosity. And something else Richard couldn't quite name. She stepped fully into the penthouse, closing the door behind her. So, she said calmly, you're the billionaire who lost everything. Mara didn't wait for permission to sit down. She dropped her laptop bag onto Richard's coffee table, the same table that had once hosted Pentagon briefings and billion-dollar negotiations, and surveyed the wreckage of his life with the clinical detachment of a crime scene investigator. Empty bottles. Scattered financial statements. Documents marked with red stamps that screamed seized and pending investigation. Mara, Rachel said, a warning in her voice, we should go. Mr. Hale needs his space. Mr. Hale needs a lot of things, Mara interrupted, still looking at Richard. Space isn't one of them. Richard set down his bourbon, irritation cutting through the fog of alcohol and exhaustion. I don't remember asking for your analysis. You didn't. Mara pulled her laptop from the bag, held together with duct tape and plastered with coding stickers from conferences Richard had probably sponsored. But Mom's been worried about you for 3 days. And I got tired of listening to her worry. So you, what? Decided to check on the fallen billionaire? I decided to see if the news got it right. Mara opened her laptop, the screen flickering to life. They're saying you either sabotaged your own system or were too incompetent to stop someone else from doing it. Which is it? Mara. Rachel moved forward, mortified. That's inappropriate. It's honest. Mara's eyes didn't leave Richard's. And honestly, I don't think he sabotaged anything. I think someone made him look guilty because he was too arrogant to see it coming. The words should have stung. Instead, they felt startlingly accurate. Richard leaned back against the sofa. And you know this how? You some kind of expert on corporate sabotage? No, Mara's fingers moved across her keyboard. But I am pretty good with systems analysis. Computer science major at community college. I've been debugging code since I was 14. She glanced up. You hired the best analysts money could buy. They missed something. Maybe because they were looking too hard, or maybe because someone didn't want them to find it. The FBI has hundreds of agents investigating. The FBI is building a case. That's different than finding the truth. Mara nodded toward the scattered documents. Those system logs. Richard followed her gaze to a stack of printouts Amara had given him before the board vote, the last documents he'd managed to take before being locked out of his own company. What about them? Can I look? Something in her tone, not pleading, not demanding, just asking, made Richard pause. This girl, this teenager with a second-hand laptop, had walked into his catastrophe without fear or judgment. Just direct, unflinching questions. He gestured toward the papers. Be my guest. Mara moved quickly, gathering the logs and spreading them across the floor. She knelt beside them, scanning pages with a speed that suggested she wasn't just reading, she was parsing, analyzing, connecting patterns most people wouldn't even recognize as data. Richard watched her work, something stirring beneath his resignation. Curiosity, maybe. Or just the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might see what he'd missed. Some think Richard deserved what happened, that his arrogance, his dismissal of warnings, his treatment of people as expendable made the collapse inevitable. Others say no one deserves betrayal, that sabotage is a crime regardless of the victim's flaws. What do you believe? Because what happened next would challenge both perspectives. Here. Mara's finger stopped on a line of code buried deep in a system diagnostic. This timestamp. See how it's exactly 7 seconds before the cascade started? Richard moved closer, squinting at the printout. That's just a routine system check. Except routine checks don't execute with root-level privileges. Mara pulled out her phone, taking a photo of the page. And they definitely don't spawn 12 child processes that all terminate within milliseconds of system failure. Richard felt something shift in his chest. What are you saying? I'm saying someone triggered the collapse manually. They disguised it as automated maintenance, but look, she grabbed another page, comparing timestamps. These access logs show someone authenticated from inside your building at 8:41 p.m. 2 minutes before Sentinel started eating itself. The FBI already analyzed those logs. They said the access came from my credentials. Your credentials, Mara repeated, looking up at him with sharp eyes. Not you. There's a difference. Richard's pulse quickened. Someone stole my login. Or cloned it. Or had legitimate access through your account because, she trailed off, studying another document. Who else had administrative privileges? Just me and my chief engineer. Dual authentication for any core system changes. And your board members? Richard froze. Board members have oversight access. Read only. They can't execute commands. Can't or shouldn't. Mara's voice was gentle but relentless. Because if someone on your board had the technical knowledge to elevate their permissions, or convinced someone who did, then your dual authentication wouldn't matter. They could make moves that looked like they came from you. The room tilted slightly. Richard sat down hard on the edge of the sofa. That's impossible. The board voted me out because of the collapse. Why would they destroy the company just to remove me? Maybe they didn't want to destroy it. Mara gathered more documents, her fingers moving faster now, chasing something Richard couldn't quite see. Maybe they wanted to take it. Think about it, you're gone, stock price crashes, institutional investors panic and sell. Someone could buy controlling interest for pennies on the dollar. That's, Richard stopped. It wasn't insane. It was elegant. Brutal and elegant. You don't believe me, Mara said, reading his expression. I believe you're intelligent. But you're also 19 years old with a community college laptop making accusations about people who've been running Fortune 500 companies since before you were born. So experience beats evidence. Experience means understanding that corporate sabotage requires more than clever code. It requires motive, opportunity, and the kind of connections that, Richard caught himself. He sounded exactly like he had dismissing Amara's warnings. Ego over reality. Mara watched him realize it. The kind of connections that someone on your board would have. Richard rubbed his face. Even if you're right, and that's a massive if, we can't prove anything. The FBI seized all our servers. Every piece of evidence is locked behind federal warrants I can't access. You can't access the servers, Mara agreed. But these printouts? They're enough to start tracing patterns. She opened her laptop again. If I can isolate the authentication signature from whoever triggered the collapse, I can compare it against known access patterns. See if it matches anyone specific. That would take weeks. Months, maybe. It would take your experts weeks. Mara's fingers were already flying across her keyboard. I'm not your expert. I'm just someone who's really, really good at finding things people try to hide. Rachel had been silent through the entire exchange, watching her daughter work with a mixture of pride and concern. Now she spoke quietly. Mara, honey, if this is as serious as you're saying, shouldn't the FBI? The FBI thinks Mr. Hale is guilty, Mara said without looking up. They're not looking for evidence that clears him. They're building a case to convict him. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in days. Not hope, not quite. But possibility. How long would it take you, he asked, to find this signature? If it's in these documents? Maybe an hour. Mara's screen filled with cascading text as she loaded the photos she'd taken. If it's not, then we're back to square one. And if you find it? Then we'll know who destroyed your company. She looked up, and her eyes held unexpected steel. And we can decide what to do about it. Richard should have sent her away. Should have told this teenager to leave the wreckage to professionals. But something in her certainty, her complete lack of doubt, made him want to believe. 1 hour, he said. Mara nodded and bent back over her laptop. 53 minutes later, she went completely still. Mr. Hale. Something in her voice made his stomach drop. You found something. I found the signature. Mara turned the laptop toward him, her face pale. The authentication pattern. The person who triggered Sentinel's collapse. Richard moved closer, staring at the screen. Lines of code, access timestamps, a digital fingerprint that matched against stored patterns with 97% certainty. Who is it? Mara's finger pointed to a name in the access log. Richard stopped breathing. Because the name on the screen belonged to someone he trusted for 15 years. Someone who'd sat across from him 3 days ago and voted him out with sympathetic eyes and careful words about protecting the company. Vice Chairman Lennox. Richard stared at Lennox's name on the screen until the letters stopped making sense. That can't be right. His voice sounded distant, disconnected. Run it again. Mara's fingers moved across her keyboard. I've run it 3 times. The authentication signature matches. Vice Chairman Lennox accessed Sentinel's core systems at 8:41 p.m. using elevated privileges that shouldn't exist on a board oversight account. Shouldn't exist, or don't exist. Didn't exist until someone created them. Mara pulled up another window, lines of configuration code that looked like gibberish to Richard. Someone modified the permission structure 6 weeks before the collapse. Added a backdoor that gave board-level accounts temporary root access during emergency maintenance windows. Richard's mind raced. We don't have emergency maintenance windows. Exactly. Mara highlighted a section of code. Someone created the policy, buried it in a routine security update, and made sure it would only activate under specific conditions. Conditions that happened to occur the night Sentinel went live. Rachel spoke from the doorway, her voice quiet but firm. Mara, are you absolutely certain about this? Because if you're wrong. I'm not wrong, Mom. Mara turned the laptop toward her mother, showing her the evidence with surprising patience. Look at the timestamp sequence. Lennox's account authenticates. 7 seconds later, the maintenance window opens. 12 seconds after that, the sabotage commands execute. It's not coincidence, it's choreography. Richard stood, pacing to the window. Below, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. People working, living, building their small empires while his crumbled. Lennox had stood beside him through everything: hostile takeovers, congressional hearings, the death of Richard's father 3 years ago. They'd built Hale Dynamics together. Or Richard had thought they did. Why? Richard's voice cracked slightly. Why would he destroy the company we built together? Maybe he didn't want to destroy it, Mara said. Maybe he wanted to take it. Richard turned. Explain. What she finds next flips the investigation upside down, revealing not just betrayal, but ambition so calculated it had been years in the making. Mara opened a new document, pulling financial data from the printed statements scattered across Richard's floor. After your board vote, Hale Dynamics stock crashed 62%, right? You know it did. And institutional investors started panic selling within hours. Mara's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up public trading records. But look at this, a shell corporation called Meridian Holdings started buying up shares 2 hours after the market opened. Not panic buying. Strategic acquisition. They purchased 11% of outstanding stock before trading closed that day. Richard felt cold. Who owns Meridian Holdings? That's the beautiful part, it's buried under 6 layers of subsidiaries and offshore entities. Mara switched windows again, showing a web of corporate structures that would have taken Richard's lawyers weeks to untangle. But I traced the registration documents. Meridian was incorporated 8 months ago. And the law firm that filed the paperwork? Keswick and Bourne. Lennox's personal attorneys. Bingo. Mara leaned back, her expression grim. He's been planning this for at least 8 months. Maybe longer. He created the infrastructure to buy control of your company after tanking its value. Richard's hands clenched. That's securities fraud. Market manipulation. He'd face federal charges. Only if someone can prove he sabotaged Sentinel to cause the crash. Mara gestured at her laptop. Right now, the FBI thinks you did it. They're not looking at Lennox. They're not following his money. They're building a case against you while he quietly purchases your company. Rachel moved closer to her daughter, concern etched in every line of her face. Mara, if this man is as dangerous as you're saying, if he destroyed an entire company just to steal it, then what happens when he finds out you're investigating him? The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard hadn't considered that. Hadn't thought past the shock of betrayal to the practical reality that Lennox was still powerful, still connected, still operating from a position of strength while Richard had nothing. We need more evidence, Richard said finally. Something concrete enough to take to the FBI. Something they can't ignore. Agreed. Mara pulled up the access logs again, studying them with the intensity of someone reading poetry. The authentication signature tells us who, but not how. Lennox had board oversight access, but he shouldn't have been able to modify core systems. Someone had to help him, someone with actual programming authority. My engineering team was vetted for years. Background checks, security clearances. I'm not talking about your engineering team. Mara zoomed in on a section of code that looked identical to everything around it. To Richard, it was just text. To Mara, it was apparently a roadmap. Look at how these permissions were elevated. This isn't brute force hacking. It's elegant. Surgical. Someone who understood Sentinel's architecture intimately wrote this backdoor. Richard felt his stomach turn. You're saying someone on my senior staff helped him. I'm saying someone with deep system knowledge created the vulnerability. Whether they knew Lennox would exploit it, Mara shrugged. That's harder to prove. Rachel had been listening quietly, but now she spoke with the careful wisdom of someone who'd spent years observing people more powerful than herself. Mr. Hale, who had the most to gain from you being removed? Richard wanted to say no one. Wanted to believe his leadership team had been loyal. But Rachel's question forced him to think like the strategist he'd once been instead of the victim he'd become. 3 people had root access to Sentinel, he said slowly. Myself, Amara Okonkwo, and, he stopped. And? Mara prompted. Dr. Victor Chen. My chief systems architect. He designed Sentinel's core framework. Richard's voice went hollow. He's also Lennox's brother-in-law. The room went silent. Mara's fingers started moving again, faster now, chasing a new thread. If Chen built the backdoor for Lennox, there'd be evidence in his personal work logs. Coding patterns, timestamps when he was working alone. All of which are on servers the FBI seized. Not all of them. Mara pulled up a new window, Richard's personal cloud backup system. You backed up executive communications, right? Emails, file transfers, project logs. Richard nodded slowly. Standard protocol. But Chen would have been careful. He wouldn't have discussed sabotage in trackable communications. He wouldn't discuss it explicitly, Mara agreed. But code leaves signatures. If Chen wrote the backdoor, his coding style would match. And if he communicated with Lennox about security updates or permission modifications around the time the backdoor was created, she trailed off, her screen filling with email headers. When was the last time you checked your backup logs? The FBI told me not to access any company systems. Good thing this isn't a company system. Mara glanced at him. It's your personal backup. Technically legal to access. Morally gray, but legal. Richard made a decision. Do it. Mara dove into his backup archive with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Rachel moved to sit beside Richard, and he was surprised when she gently touched his shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity that somehow made the betrayal hurt more rather than less. You trusted them, Rachel said softly. I did. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Richard didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Because part of him still didn't want to believe that Lennox, his partner, his friend, had orchestrated this entire collapse. Got something. Mara's voice cut through his thoughts. Email from Chen to Lennox, dated 7 weeks before the collapse. Subject line, Permission Architecture Revision for Board Oversight Compliance. Richard leaned forward. What does it say? Mara opened the email. The language was technical, bureaucratic, exactly the kind of routine communication that happened hundreds of times in a company Hale Dynamics size. But buried in the 3rd paragraph was a single line that made Richard's blood run cold. Emergency access protocols will activate automatically during system-wide stress tests, ensuring board oversight capabilities remain intact during critical operations. That's the backdoor, Richard breathed. He's describing the backdoor and making it sound like a compliance feature. And Lennox responded. Mara pulled up the reply. Excellent work, Victor. This addresses my concerns completely. Proceed with implementation. Richard stood, his hands shaking, not with fear, but with rage. They planned this. 4 months. While I was pushing the team, hosting investors, building Sentinel into something revolutionary, they were sabotaging it from the inside. Not sabotaging, Mara corrected quietly. Stealing. She turned her laptop toward him one more time. On the screen was a network diagram showing data flows, access points, and modification timestamps. At the center of the web were 2 nodes, connected by dozens of threads. Chen and Lennox. The backdoor was created from inside your headquarters, Mara said. But it was triggered remotely. Want to guess where the remote access originated? Richard already knew. The boardroom. The boardroom server, specifically. During your emergency board meeting, the one where they voted you out. Mara's eyes met his. Lennox was sitting right across from you, looking sympathetic, talking about protecting the company. And the whole time, his laptop was connected to your network, executing the final commands that would make sure the FBI's investigation pointed directly at you. Richard felt something break and reform inside him, grief transforming into determination. "We take this to the FBI," he said. "They won't believe us," Mara countered. "Not without more. Right now, this is just emails and access logs that could be interpreted as legitimate work. We need something that shows intent. Something that proves Lennox knew he was sabotaging the system and did it anyway. Then we find it." Richard looked at this 19-year-old girl who'd walked into his wreckage and started rebuilding what his experts couldn't. "Whatever it takes." Mara smiled, small, fierce, determined. "Then we start with the boardroom server." The plan was insane. Richard knew it. Mara knew it. And Rachel, standing in Richard's penthouse at 2 a.m., arms crossed, maternal concern radiating from every pore, definitely knew it. "You want to break into a building that's under federal investigation," Rachel said slowly, "to access servers that the FBI explicitly told you not to touch." "Technically, we're not breaking in," Richard corrected. "You have legitimate access credentials. I have cleaning credentials. For the lobby and executive floors. Not for the server room. Which is why I'll be there," Mara added, fingers flying across her laptop. "I can bypass the security protocols once we're inside. But we need physical access to the boardroom server. The backups I pulled from Mr. Hale's personal cloud only show us what Chen and Lennox communicated. The boardroom server will show us what Lennox actually did, the commands he executed the night of the collapse." Richard paced the length of his living room. 48 hours ago, he'd been ready to disappear into obscurity, to let the federal investigation run its course and accept whatever verdict they delivered. Now, standing on the edge of doing something that could land him in actual prison, he felt more alive than he had in weeks. "The building has 24-hour security," he said, thinking through the logistics. 3 guards on rotation. Cameras in every hallway. Badge scanners at every restricted door. But minimal overnight staff, Mara countered. "Your cleaning crews work between midnight and 5 a.m. Security's used to seeing service personnel moving through the building during those hours." "They're used to seeing service personnel," Richard agreed. "They're not used to seeing me. So you don't go in as Richard Hale, Billionaire CEO." Mara looked up, and her eyes held that same fierce intelligence that had first made him listen to her. "You go in as maintenance staff. Hat pulled low. Mom's old work jacket. Keep your head down and move like you belong there." Rachel closed her eyes. "I cannot believe I'm considering this. Mom." Mara's voice softened. "We don't have another option. The FBI isn't investigating Lennox. They're building a case against Mr. Hale. If we don't get proof, real, undeniable proof, then Lennox wins. He steals the company, and Mr. Hale goes to prison for a crime he didn't commit. And if you get caught, then I go to prison for a crime I did commit," Richard said quietly. "Which is still better than going for one I didn't." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she sighed, the sound of a mother who knew her daughter wouldn't be dissuaded. "We go in at 3 a.m. Guard rotation happens at 2:45. We'll have 15 minutes before the new shift settles in and starts paying close attention." Richard felt something unexpected, gratitude mixed with guilt. "Rachel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She met his eyes. "Because 5 years ago, you helped me when I needed it. And because my daughter's right, nobody deserves to be destroyed by a lie." They arrived at Hale Dynamics at 2:52 a.m. The building rose against the night sky like a monument to everything Richard had lost. Glass and steel reflecting city lights. His name still etched in the lobby directory, though he knew it would be removed within days. 63 floors of ambition and innovation that now belonged to his enemies. Or would, if they succeeded. Rachel swiped her badge at the service entrance. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. They slipped inside, Rachel first, then Mara with her laptop bag, finally Richard in a borrowed maintenance jacket 2 sizes too large, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The lobby security guard glanced up from his phone, nodded at Rachel. "Late night, Ms. Cooper." "Forgot some supplies earlier," Rachel said, her voice steady. "Won't be long." The guard waved them through without a second look. Why would he? Rachel had been cleaning this building for 5 years. She was part of the invisible infrastructure that kept the kingdom running. They took the service elevator to the 47th floor. Executive level. Where the boardroom sat with its wall of windows and its server closet that Richard had walked past 1,000 times without ever thinking about. The elevator doors opened onto darkness. "Stay close," Rachel whispered, leading them down the hallway with the confidence of someone who'd navigated these corridors in the dark countless times before. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. Every shadow looked like a security guard. Every camera felt like an eye tracking his movement. This was his building, he'd designed half these floors, approved every security measure, and now he was sneaking through it like a thief. They reached the boardroom. Rachel swiped her badge. The lock flashed red, restricted access after hours, Mara murmured, already pulling out her laptop. "Give me 30 seconds. She connected a small device to the badge reader, her fingers dancing across her keyboard. Code scrolled past, bypasses, exploits, digital skeleton keys that shouldn't exist but apparently did in the mind of a 19-year-old who was very, very good at finding ways through locked doors. The lock flashed green. They slipped inside. The boardroom looked different at night. Less imposing. The table where 23 people had voted Richard out sat empty, chairs pushed in with eerie precision. And in the corner, hidden behind an oak panel, was the server closet. Mara moved straight for it, pulling the panel open. Inside, racks of equipment hummed quietly, the digital heart of executive communications. "This is it," she whispered. "The boardroom server. Every command executed from laptops connected to this network gets logged here." Richard watched her work, connecting her laptop to the server with cables she'd apparently brought for exactly this purpose. "How long?" 5 minutes to access. Maybe 10 to download everything we need." Her screen filled with code. "The logs are encrypted, but I can break." She stopped. Her face went pale in the glow of her screen. "What?" Richard moved closer. "What's wrong?" "The access logs." Mara's voice was barely audible. "Someone's been reviewing them. Recently. Like, 30 minutes ago recently." Richard felt ice slide down his spine. "Who?" "I don't know. But whoever it was, they were looking at the same timestamps we are. The night of the collapse. Lennox's access points." She looked up, fear replacing confidence for the first time since he'd met her. "Someone knows we're investigating." A sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Multiple sets. Rachel grabbed Richard's arm. "We need to go. Now. Not without the data." "I'm downloading," Mara hissed, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "But it's going to take 3 minutes minimum." The footsteps grew louder. Richard made a decision. "Rachel, take Mara and go. Service stairs. I'll create a distraction. We're not leaving you." "That's not a request." Richard moved toward the door. "Get that data out of the building. That's all that matters." But before anyone could move, Mara's laptop chimed softly. "Download complete," she whispered, yanking cables free. "We can." The boardroom lights blazed to life. All 3 of them froze. But the room was empty. No security guards. No federal agents. Just lights that had turned on by themselves. Or been turned on remotely. Mara stared at her laptop screen, and her expression shifted from fear to something worse. "Oh no." "What?" "The cameras." She pointed to the small dome in the ceiling corner. They've been active this whole time. And the feed, she typed frantically. The feed isn't going to building security. Then where? It's being routed to an external IP address. Mara's hands shook slightly. Someone's been watching us. This entire time. They saw us come in. They watched us access the server. They know exactly what we took. Richard felt understanding crash over him like cold water. Someone inside Hale Dynamics wanted them inside that building. Wanted them to find the evidence, wanted them to break in and access restricted servers so they could be caught in the act. It's a trap, he breathed. And somewhere across the city, in an office Richard could only imagine, an alert pinged on Vice Chairman Lennox's phone. Subjects in building. Evidence accessed. Proceed to Phase 3. Lennox smiled in the darkness of his study and made a single phone call. By dawn, Richard Hale's problems would get considerably worse. They made it out of Hale Dynamics with minutes to spare. Rachel led them through service corridors Richard had never known existed, down concrete stairwells that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. By the time they burst through the loading dock exit, sirens were already converging on the building's main entrance, not building security, but something worse. Federal vehicles. Black SUVs with government plates. Go, Richard urged, pushing Rachel and Mara toward the street. Split up. I'll draw them. No, Mara grabbed his arm with surprising strength. They're not here for us. Look. She was right. The vehicles weren't blocking exits. They were staging at the front entrance, agents moving with the organized calm of a planned operation, not an emergency response. This wasn't about catching intruders. This was something else. They disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, three shadows moving through alleys that serviced the buildings Richard used to command. By the time they reached Rachel's apartment in a neighborhood Richard had never visited, small, worn, but impeccably clean, the sun was threatening the horizon. Mara immediately set up her laptop on Rachel's kitchen table, connecting to her own secured network rather than risk any traceable connection to Richard's compromised systems. Tell me you got everything, Richard said, his voice tight. I got everything that was on that server. Mara's fingers flew across her keyboard. Whether it's enough, she trailed off, her screen filling with encrypted data logs. This is going to take time to decrypt. How much time? Hours. Maybe longer if Lennox used military-grade encryption. She stopped, her eyes widening. Oh, he didn't. Didn't what? Use military-grade encryption. Mara leaned closer to her screen, something like wonder mixing with disgust in her expression. He used standard corporate protocols. The same encryption Hale Dynamics uses for routine board communications. Richard felt a chill. He wasn't trying to hide it. He wasn't trying to hide it from internal review, Mara corrected. Because he thought he'd control the company before anyone looked. Why encrypt something heavily when you're planning to own the servers it's stored on? Rachel set coffee cups in front of them, the automatic hospitality of a woman who'd spent years caring for others. How long to decrypt standard protocols? 20 minutes. Mara was already running decryption algorithms. Maybe less. It took 17. When the data finally resolved into readable logs, command histories, and time-stamped communications, Mara went completely still. Mr. Hale, she said quietly. You need to see this. Richard moved behind her, reading over her shoulder. What he saw made his blood run cold. The logs showed everything. Every command Lennox had executed the night of the collapse. Every backdoor Chen had built into Sentinel's architecture over 6 months of careful preparation. But more than that, they showed why. Mara opened a file labeled phase_2_acquisition. Inside was a detailed plan, dated 11 months before Sentinel's collapse. A strategy document outlining exactly how to engineer a catastrophic failure, tank the stock price, acquire majority control through shell corporations, and restructure Hale Dynamics under new leadership. Lennox's leadership. He planned this for almost a year, Richard breathed. Before we even announced Sentinel's final testing schedule. It gets worse. Mara scrolled down. Look at the target acquisition timeline. He wasn't just planning to take control of Hale Dynamics. He was planning to leverage your defense contracts into a monopoly. Sentinel was supposed to fail publicly enough that Congress would authorize emergency defense appropriations. And Lennox's restructured company would be the only one positioned to fulfill those contracts. We've all seen betrayals, the business partner who steals clients, the friend who spreads rumors, the spouse who breaks trust. But nothing this calculated, nothing that turns 15 years of partnership into a weapon designed to destroy you. Richard felt something break inside him. Not rage. Not even surprise anymore. Just a hollow understanding that the man he trusted most in the world had been planning his destruction for longer than some people planned their weddings. There's more, Mara said, her voice almost apologetic. She opened another file, email communications between Lennox and Chen, but also between Lennox and someone else. Someone whose name made Richard's hands clench. Dr. Amara Okonkwo. No, Richard said immediately. Amara tried to warn me. She fought me on the launch timeline. Because Lennox told her to. Mara pulled up an email chain. Look at the dates. 3 weeks before the collapse, Lennox reached out to her privately. Told her he had concerns about security vulnerabilities Chen had confided to him. Asked her to raise flags with you, knowing you'd dismiss them. Richard read the emails, each one feeling like a knife sliding between his ribs. Lennox to Okonkwo, Richard trusts you. He'll listen if you present concerns, even if he initially resists. Okonkwo to Lennox, I've raised the anomalies with him 3 times. He won't delay the launch. Lennox to Okonkwo, keep trying. Document every warning you give him. It's important that there's a record of his dismissiveness. He set me up, Richard said hollowly. He had Amara create a paper trail of warnings I ignored. So when everything collapsed, it would look like my arrogance caused it. It gets worse, Mara said, and Richard almost laughed because how could it possibly get worse? She pulled up a final document, a legal brief, already drafted, waiting to be filed. Lennox has a wrongful termination lawsuit ready to go. He's planning to sue you personally for gross negligence, claiming he tried to stop the Sentinel launch and you overruled him. He's going to use your own company's collapse to bankrupt you individually. Richard sat down hard in one of Rachel's kitchen chairs. The kind of chair that had seen years of use, held countless family dinners, probably supported Rachel through grief when her husband died. Honest furniture in an honest home, so different from the sterile perfection of his penthouse. I ignored every warning, he said quietly. Amara told me something was wrong. Multiple times. And I shut her down because I thought I knew better. You didn't know you were being manipulated, Rachel said gently, sitting beside him. I should have. Richard's voice cracked. That's what makes this brilliant. Lennox didn't just sabotage my company, he sabotaged my judgment. He knew exactly how to push me. Knew I'd dismiss warnings as paranoia. Knew my ego would do half his work for him. Stop. Mara's voice cut through his spiral with unexpected force. You want to sit here feeling guilty about being human? Fine. Do that after we stop him. But right now, we have evidence. Real, documented, undeniable evidence that Lennox orchestrated everything. Evidence we obtained illegally. Evidence that shows you're innocent. Mara turned her laptop toward him. We have his communications with Chen. We have the acquisition strategy. We have time-stamped proof that he executed the sabotage commands. We have everything we need to clear your name and put him in prison. Richard looked at the data, then at Mara's determined face, then at Rachel's steady presence beside him. The FBI won't accept evidence obtained through breaking and entering. Then we don't give it to the FBI first. Mara pulled up a new window. We give it to the media. We give it to the Pentagon. We give it to every regulatory agency and congressional oversight committee simultaneously. We flood the zone with truth before Lennox can spin another lie. That's career suicide for a 19-year-old hacker. I'm a 20-year-old computer science student helping to expose corporate fraud, Mara corrected. And I'm fine with the risk. Rachel spoke quietly. Mara's right, Mr. Hale, you can't fight Lennox by playing by rules he's already broken. You need to do what he never expected, survive long enough to fight back. Richard looked between them, a woman who cleaned penthouses for a living and her daughter who'd barely started college. They had more courage than most people he'd commanded in boardrooms. We'd need lawyers, he said slowly. Good ones. Corporate law, securities fraud, defense contracts. I know someone, Rachel said. A lawyer who does pro bono work. My church connected me with her when my husband died. She's tough. We'd need technical experts to validate Mara's findings. Already on it. Mara was typing again. I know 3 professors at MIT who specialize in system security. If I send them this data anonymously, they'll verify it's authentic. Richard felt something shift inside him. Not hope, exactly. But purpose. Direction. The first clear path forward he'd seen since the collapse. Okay, he said. We do this. We. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Richard almost ignored it. Then something made him answer. Hello. Richard. Lennox's voice was smooth, warm, exactly as it had always been. I think we need to talk. Richard's blood turned to ice. He put the phone on speaker. I have nothing to say to you. That's unfortunate. Lennox sounded almost sad. Because I have quite a bit to say to you. Specifically about your little field trip to Hale Dynamics tonight. Breaking into a building under federal investigation. Accessing restricted servers. Really, Richard. I expected better. Mara's face went pale. Rachel's hand found Richard's shoulder, gripping tight. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard said, keeping his voice steady. Of course you don't. Lennox chuckled. Just like you don't know about the young woman sitting next to you right now. Mara Cooper, isn't it? Rachel's daughter. Bright girl. Gifted with computers. It would be a shame if her promising future was destroyed by felony charges. Richard felt rage replace fear. You threaten her again and I'll. You'll what? Lennox's voice hardened. You're broke, Richard. Disgraced. Under investigation. You have no power here. But I do. I have the company. I have the contracts. And I have security footage of 3 people breaking into Hale Dynamics at 3 a.m. and accessing servers they had no authorization to touch. Silence. Then Lennox continued, his tone almost gentle. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to delete whatever data you think you found. You're going to disappear quietly. And in exchange, I won't press charges against Rachel or her daughter. I'll let them go back to their simple, honest lives. And if I don't? Then I make one phone call, and federal agents arrest all 3 of you within the hour. Rachel loses her daughter. Mara loses her future. And you? You go to prison for the rest of your life. Lennox paused. Your choice, Richard. Make it fast. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone, Lennox's threat hanging in the air like poison. Mara spoke first, her voice shaking but determined. He's bluffing. He can't prove we were there without revealing he was watching us. Which means admitting he had unauthorized access to building security. He doesn't need proof, Richard said hollowly. He needs leverage. And he just found it. Rachel stood, her expression harder than Richard had ever seen it. Then we move faster than he expects. We release everything. Tonight. Before he can make that call. Richard looked at her, this woman who'd spent 5 years invisibly supporting his life, now risking everything to save it. Are you sure? He asked. Once we do this, there's no going back. Lennox will come after you with everything he has. Rachel met his eyes. Mr. Hale, I've spent my whole life being invisible to people like Lennox. People who think power makes them untouchable. She smiled, fierce and certain. Time to remind him what invisible people can do when they decide to be seen. Mara pulled up her contact list, fingers already moving. I'm sending the data package now. Media, regulatory agencies, congressional oversight. Everything hit simultaneously in 90 minutes. Richard felt something he hadn't felt since the collapse. Not hope. Not yet. But the possibility of hope. The chance to fight back. Do it, he said. And somewhere across the city, Vice Chairman Lennox refreshed his phone, waiting for Richard's surrender. He would be waiting a long time. The media circus began before dawn. By the time Richard, Mara, and Rachel arrived at the federal courthouse, news vans lined the street 3 deep. Cameras tracked their movement like predators watching prey. Reporters shouted questions that blurred into a wall of noise, accusations and curiosity and hunger for a story that had transformed overnight from simple corporate collapse into something far more sinister. Richard had released the evidence at 4 a.m. Every major outlet, every regulatory agency, every congressional oversight committee received the same package simultaneously, time-stamped logs, encrypted communications, acquisition strategies, and a single cover letter explaining exactly how Vice Chairman Lennox had engineered the destruction of Hale Dynamics. The response had been instantaneous and chaotic. Emergency DOJ meetings. Congressional hearings fast-tracked. And most importantly, criminal charges filed against Lennox and Dr. Victor Chen for conspiracy, securities fraud, sabotage, and a dozen other felonies that carried decades of prison time. Now, 6 weeks later, the trial had become a national spectacle. Richard pushed through the crowd, Rachel on one side, Mara on the other. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. He kept his head up, his expression neutral, projecting a confidence he only partially felt. Mr. Hale. Do you expect to be vindicated? Mr. Hale. What do you say to accusations that you're framing your former partner? Mr. Hale. Is it true your key witness is your maid's daughter? That last one stung not because it was false, but because of how it was phrased, as if Mara's parentage somehow invalidated her expertise. As if being Rachel's daughter made her less capable of dismantling the most sophisticated corporate fraud in defense industry history. They entered the courthouse through a security checkpoint that felt more like a military installation. Metal detectors. ID verification. Armed marshals who looked like they expected violence. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Richard's legal team, led by Margaret Torres, the pro bono attorney Rachel had connected him with, sat at one table. Across the aisle, Lennox and Chen were flanked by a wall of expensive lawyers in suits that probably cost more than Rachel earned in 6 months. Lennox met Richard's eyes across the courtroom. He smiled. Not smugly. Not arrogantly. Just, pleasantly. Like they were old friends meeting for lunch rather than former partners whose conflict was about to be decided by 12 strangers. Richard felt his hands clench. That smile, that practiced, perfect smile, had been there through everything. Through acquisitions and celebrations and the board meeting where Lennox had voted him out with sympathetic eyes and careful words about protecting the company. How had he never seen the calculation behind it? All rise. Judge Patricia Brennan entered, 60-something, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for running her courtroom like a precision instrument. No theatrics. No nonsense. Just facts, evidence, and the law applied without mercy or favoritism. The trial began. The prosecution laid out their case with methodical brutality. Financial records showing Lennox's shell corporations. Communication logs proving coordination with Chen. Expert testimony explaining how the backdoor had been built and triggered. Every piece of evidence Mara had uncovered, now presented in court by attorneys who made it sound obvious, inevitable, damning. But Lennox's defense was equally prepared. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Gerald Morrison, Lennox's lead attorney, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "what we have here is a desperate man, Mr. Hale, attempting to salvage his reputation by destroying his former partners. The prosecution would have you believe that Vice Chairman Lennox, a man with 30 years of impeccable service to the defense industry, suddenly decided to commit corporate sabotage. Why? What possible motive could he have?" Morrison paused, letting the question hang. "The answer is simple, he didn't. What actually happened is that Mr. Hale, facing federal investigation for his own negligence, manufactured evidence to shift blame. He broke into Hale Dynamics, a crime he's admitted to, and accessed servers he had no authorization to touch. And now he presents that illegally obtained evidence, as if it proves something other than his own criminal behavior." Richard watched Morrison work the room. He was good. Too good. Furthermore, Morrison continued, the prosecution's star witness, a 20-year-old community college student with no professional credentials, claims to have discovered what dozens of FBI analysts missed. Are we really to believe that Mara Cooper, daughter of Mr. Hale's cleaning lady, possesses expertise that surpasses our nation's top cybersecurity experts? Mara's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. Richard had watched her prepare for this, hours spent with Margaret Torres, practicing testimony, anticipating attacks, learning to present technical evidence in language jurors could understand. "This isn't a case about corporate conspiracy," Morrison said, his voice rising with practiced indignation. "It's a case about a failed billionaire trying to drag down the man who had the courage to save Hale Dynamics from his incompetence. Guilty or not guilty? That's what it comes down to, 12 people deciding whether Lennox is a criminal mastermind or a scapegoat for Richard's failures. Drop your verdict in the comments, because what happened next would test everything." The prosecution called Mara to the stand on day 3. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, professional without trying too hard, young without appearing naive. She took the oath with steady hands and sat facing a courtroom full of people who'd already decided whether to believe her. Margaret Torres approached with a warm smile. "Ms. Cooper, can you explain your educational background?" "I'm a junior at Metro Community College, majoring in computer science. I've been coding since I was 14. I've completed advanced courses in systems architecture, cybersecurity, and digital forensics." "And you work how many hours per week while attending school full-time?" "Between 25 and 30. I help my mom with cleaning contracts and do freelance web development." Torres nodded. "So you're not some privileged hacker playing games in a basement. You're a working student with real-world technical skills." "Objection," Morrison called. "Characterization." Sustained. Torres shifted gears. "Ms. Cooper, walk us through how you identified Vice Chairman Lennox as the source of the sabotage." Mara took a breath, then began explaining in clear, precise language. Authentication signatures. Access timestamps. Permission escalations. She used analogies, comparing system backdoors to hidden keys, comparing data corruption to deliberately setting fire to files in a specific sequence. The jury leaned forward. Morrison's cross-examination was surgical. "Ms. Cooper, you have no professional certifications, correct?" "Correct." "No degree yet?" "Not yet." "No employment history in cybersecurity?" "I've done freelance work." "For major corporations?" "Defense contractors?" "Government agencies?" "No." Morrison smiled, gentle and devastating. So you're asking this jury to trust your analysis over experts with decades of experience, advanced degrees, and security clearances? Mara met his eyes. I'm asking the jury to trust the evidence, which speaks for itself regardless of who found it. Evidence you obtained through criminal trespass. Evidence that proves Mr. Hale's innocence and Mr. Lennox's guilt. Or evidence you fabricated to help your mother's employer. The courtroom went silent. Mara's voice didn't waver. Mr. Morrison, if I had the technical skill to fabricate evidence convincing enough to fool FBI analysts, I wouldn't be attending community college. I'd be running a Fortune 500 company. Scattered laughter from the gallery. Morrison pressed harder. You're emotionally invested in Mr. Hale's vindication. I'm invested in the truth. Truth according to a 20-year-old with no credentials. Truth according to authentication logs that don't lie, access signatures that can't be faked, and communication records that show exactly what Mr. Lennox planned and when. Mara leaned forward slightly. You can question my age, my education, my background. But you can't question mathematics. And the math proves your client sabotaged Sentinel. Margaret Torres introduced the technical evidence piece by piece. Expert witnesses validated Mara's analysis. MIT professors confirmed the authentication signatures were genuine. Former NSA analysts testified that the backdoor showed sophisticated insider knowledge. The case built like a wall, brick by brick, fact by fact, until even Morrison's rhetorical skill couldn't tear it down. Richard watched it unfold with something like awe. This girl, this 20-year-old who'd walked into his penthouse carrying a second-hand laptop, was systematically dismantling a conspiracy that had taken 15 years of partnership to build. On day 7, the prosecution played their final card, a recorded phone call between Lennox and Chen, discussing Phase 2 implementation just hours before Sentinel's collapse. The courtroom listened in silence as Lennox's voice, calm, pleasant, unmistakable, gave instructions on trigger timing and evidence cleanup. When it finished, several jurors were staring at Lennox with open disgust. Morrison requested a recess. When they returned, his expression had shifted from confident to contained. Your Honor, he said, my client would like to make a statement. Lennox stood. Still composed. Still smiling that practiced smile. I did engineer Sentinel's collapse, he said calmly. Everything Mr. Hale and Ms. Cooper have presented is accurate. I sabotaged the system. I planned the acquisition. I framed Richard for my own crimes. The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. Morrison looked like he'd been struck. Mr. Lennox, I strongly advise. It doesn't matter anymore, Gerald. Lennox's voice carried across the chaos. They have everything. The communications. The logs. The phone recordings. Fighting this just delays the inevitable. He turned to face Richard directly. I did it because you were going to waste Sentinel. You were going to let defense contracts sit in bureaucratic committees for years while you perfected your precious algorithms. I saw an opportunity to streamline the process, to build something that would actually serve national security instead of your ego. Richard felt rage and something else, pity for a man who'd convinced himself betrayal was patriotism. But here's the thing you should know, Lennox continued, his smile finally cracking into something harder. I didn't do it alone. The board knew. Half of them, anyway. They knew I was planning to acquire control. They approved it. Because they understood what you never did, that Hale Dynamics was bigger than Richard Hale. The courtroom went deathly quiet. Margaret Torres was already on her feet. Your Honor, if Mr. Lennox is implicating additional conspirators. I am. Lennox pulled a flash drive from his pocket, holding it up. This contains communications with board members who actively supported the takeover. They're all complicit. Morrison grabbed his client's arm. Stop talking. Why? Lennox shook him off. It's over, Gerald. Has been since that girl, he nodded toward Mara. Broke my encryption. Might as well bring down everyone who deserves it. Judge Brennan's voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Lennox, you will surrender that evidence to the court immediately. Bailiff. But Lennox was already handing the drive to the nearest marshal, his expression almost serene. Richard stared at the man he'd trusted for 15 years, now watching him systematically burn everything down, including allies who'd helped him. And despite everything, Richard felt a cold satisfaction. Because Lennox had finally made a mistake. He'd assumed confession would bring mercy. He'd forgotten that betraying co-conspirators only proved he'd betray anyone. Judge Brennan addressed the jury. In light of Mr. Lennox's confession, we'll adjourn while the prosecution evaluates the new evidence. Reconvene Monday morning. As the marshals led Lennox away, he looked back at Richard one final time. No smile now. Just the empty expression of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Richard walked out of the courthouse with Rachel and Mara, into a wall of cameras and questions that somehow felt less suffocating than before. Mr. Hale. How do you feel about Lennox's confession? Vindicated, Richard said simply. And the additional conspirators? Justice doesn't stop with one guilty man. They pushed through the crowd toward the car Margaret had arranged. But before they reached it, Richard stopped, turning to face Mara. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. Mara smiled, tired, relieved, still carrying the weight of testimony but lighter now. You would have figured it out eventually. No, Richard said honestly. I wouldn't have. I was ready to disappear. You reminded me how to fight. Rachel touched his arm gently. So what now? Richard looked back at the courthouse, at the empire he'd lost and the justice he'd won. Now, he said, we build something better. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after Lennox's confession. Richard sat between Margaret Torres and Mara, hands folded on the table, watching 12 jurors file into the courtroom with expressions that revealed nothing. Behind him, Rachel sat in the gallery, her worn cross catching the light from the high windows. The jury foreman stood, a retired engineer who'd spent the entire trial taking meticulous notes. On the charge of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, we find the defendant, James Lennox, guilty. Richard felt something release in his chest. On the charge of sabotage of critical infrastructure, guilty. Lennox sat motionless at the defense table, his practiced smile finally, permanently absent. On the charge of corporate espionage, guilty. The foreman continued through 17 charges. Guilty. 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 Dr. Victor Chen received the same verdict, every charge, every count, every crime meticulously proven by evidence Mara had uncovered and experts had validated. When it was over, Judge Brennan addressed the defendants with the cold precision of someone who'd seen enough corruption to have lost patience with it. Mr. Lennox, Dr. Chen, you used your positions of trust to orchestrate one of the most sophisticated corporate frauds in defense industry history. You sabotaged critical national security infrastructure. You attempted to monopolize contracts that protect American lives. And you did it purely for profit and power. She paused. The court sentences you both to 25 years in federal prison, followed by permanent prohibition from any defense-related work. Lennox's face drained of color. Chen looked like he might be sick. Additionally, Judge Brennan continued, the flash drive evidence Mr. Lennox provided has led to charges against 5 additional board members. Those trials will proceed separately. She turned to Richard. Mr. Hale, this court finds no evidence of wrongdoing on your part. All charges are dismissed. Your assets will be unfrozen, and your reputation restored insofar as the legal system can accomplish that. Her expression softened slightly. I also want to note that without the extraordinary investigative work of Ms. Cooper and the courage of Ms. Rachel Cooper, justice in this case might never have been served. Rachel's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Richard stood, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight lift. Not completely, grief and betrayal don't disappear with a verdict, but enough that he could breathe. Mara hugged him quickly, professionally, then pulled back with a grin. "We won." "You won," Richard corrected. "I just survived." "That's not nothing." Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy had transformed. Where there had once been accusations, now there were questions about redemption, vindication, what came next for the fallen billionaire who'd clawed his way back to innocence. Richard gave a brief statement, thanking his legal team, thanking Mara and Rachel, expressing hope that the defense industry would learn from this catastrophe. Then he left, walking away from the cameras with the two women who'd saved him. They went to a diner. Not a restaurant. Not some upscale place where Richard would have once hosted senators and military brass. Just a neighborhood diner with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since morning. Rachel ordered pie. Mara ordered pancakes despite it being 2 p.m. Richard ordered coffee and found himself smiling at the absurdity of celebrating a legal victory that had nearly destroyed all of them with comfort food in a place that didn't know or care who he'd been. "So," Mara said, pouring enough syrup on her pancakes to constitute a health hazard, "what now?" Richard had been thinking about that question for weeks. Months, really, since the moment he'd realized he might actually survive this. "The board wants me back," he said. "They sent a formal offer yesterday. Full reinstatement as CEO, compensation package that includes back pay, stock options, public apology." "That's good," Rachel said carefully. "Isn't it?" It would have been. Richard stirred his coffee, watching patterns form and dissolve. 6 months ago, it would have been everything I wanted. Vindication. Power returned. The empire restored. But? Mara prompted. But that empire was built on arrogance. Richard looked up, meeting their eyes. "I treated people like tools. Ignored warnings because I thought I was smarter than everyone else. Built a company culture where fear mattered more than truth." He paused. "Lennox destroyed it. But I made it fragile enough to destroy." Rachel reached across the table, covering his hand with hers, a gesture of comfort that would have felt invasive months ago but now felt necessary. "You're not the same man who ignored those warnings," she said quietly. "No," Richard agreed. "I'm not. Which is why I can't go back." Mara set down her fork. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I turned down the board's offer." Richard pulled out his phone, showing them the email he'd sent that morning. "I told them to find new leadership. Someone who'll build Hale Dynamics into something better than what I made it." Silence. Then Mara leaned back, studying him with those sharp, analytical eyes. "Okay. So what are you going to do instead?" Richard smiled, genuine, uncertain, but real. "I was hoping you'd help me figure that out." Over the next hour, sitting in that diner with coffee refills and half-eaten pie, they planned something new. Not a return to power. Not a restoration of the old empire. Something better. "Defense systems need transparency," Mara said, sketching ideas on napkins. "Sentinel failed because it was a black box. Nobody outside your inner circle understood how it worked. That's not just bad security, it's bad design. So we build systems with accountability built in," Richard added. "Open architecture. Third-party auditing. No single point of failure, no single person who can sabotage everything. And no single person at the top making unilateral decisions," Rachel added pointedly. Richard nodded. "Distributed leadership. Checks and balances. Transparency not as an afterthought but as a core principle." Mara's eyes lit up. "We could revolutionize defense contracting. Make it so good security and ethical operations aren't competing interests, they're the same thing." "Who's we?" Richard asked. Mara looked at him like the answer was obvious. "You, me, and Mom. Equal partners. You bring industry knowledge and capital. I bring technical expertise. Mom brings operational management and the kind of ground-level understanding that keeps companies human. I've never run a company, Rachel protested. Neither had Richard when he started Hale Dynamics, Mara countered. You've spent 5 years watching how his company operated. You know what worked and what didn't. That's more valuable than any MBA. Richard felt something shift, not hope exactly, but possibility. The chance to build something that reflected not who he'd been, but who he wanted to become. Equal partners, he repeated. Equal say in decisions. Equal ownership. Equal risk, Mara added. Equal reward, Rachel finished quietly. They shook hands across the table, a billionaire, a cleaning woman, and a community college student, forming a partnership that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. They called it Sentinel Systems. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor what it should have been. The company launched 6 months later, operating out of a converted warehouse that cost a fraction of what Richard's old headquarters had. No glass towers. No corner offices. Just open workspace, collaborative design, and a mission statement that prioritized transparency over profit. Mara led the technical team, a mix of young innovators and experienced engineers who shared her vision of ethical defense technology. She designed systems that were powerful but accountable, sophisticated but auditable, impossible to sabotage because no single person controlled them. Rachel managed operations with the steady competence of someone who'd spent years making invisible work look effortless. She built a company culture where employees were people first, where warnings were heard, where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than career-ending failures. And Richard? Richard learned to lead differently. He learned to listen. To admit uncertainty. To value the people around him not for what they could do for him, but for who they were. It was harder than commanding. Harder than controlling. But it was better. Within a year, Sentinel Systems won its first government contract, not through connections or backdoor deals, but through competitive bidding and transparent demonstration of superior technology. Within 2 years, they'd changed how defense contractors approached security architecture. And within 3 years, Richard Hale's name meant something different. Not power. Not isolation. Trust. But there was one final piece of the story. One night, working late in the lab, Mara called Richard over to her workstation. "Remember that encrypted alert Sentinel sent the night it collapsed?" she asked. Richard felt a chill. He'd almost forgotten. The mysterious packet that had pinged to an unknown IP address, logged but never explained in all the investigation chaos. "You decrypted it?" Finally. Mara's expression was troubled. "I've been working on it for months. The encryption was military grade, way beyond anything Lennox or Chen had access to." "What did it say?" Mara pulled up the decoded message. Richard read it once. Then again. Then a third time, because surely he'd misunderstood. Sentinel architecture compromised. Full system specs acquired. Replication protocols active. Estimate deployment in 36 months. Ghost network. Ghost network, Richard said slowly. "That's not. It's not any organization I've ever heard of," Mara finished. "But whoever they are, they used Lennox's sabotage as cover to steal Sentinel's complete technical specifications. While we were busy fighting each other, someone was copying the entire system." Richard sat down hard. "You're saying there's a duplicate Sentinel out there somewhere? Or there will be?" Mara's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up network traces she'd been following for weeks. The IP address that received the alert bounced through 73 proxy servers across 19 countries. Someone with serious resources and serious expertise wanted that technology. For what? That's what we need to find out. Mara looked up, and her eyes held that same fierce determination Richard had first seen in his penthouse. Because if someone's building Sentinel without accountability, without oversight, without the safety protocols we learned the hard way to implement, They could do damage on a scale that makes Lennox's betrayal look small. Mara nodded. Richard stood, looking out at the warehouse floor where his team, their team, was building something better. Something honest. Something worth protecting. Then we find them, he said. And we stop them. Could take years, Mara warned. Good thing we're not going anywhere. Mara smiled. So the fight's not over. The fight's never over, Richard said. But this time, we're fighting for the right reasons. She pulled up her tracking programs, beginning the long process of tracing Ghost Network's digital footprints across the globe. And Richard Hale, former billionaire, fallen king, redeemed partner, stood beside her, ready for whatever came next. Because he'd learned the most important lesson of his life. Empires built on arrogance crumble. But communities built on trust can change the world. And sometimes the people you overlook become the ones who save you. Sometimes the girl with the second-hand laptop sees what billion-dollar analysts miss. Sometimes the cleaning lady's quiet wisdom matters more than a board's cold calculations, sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. Richard's old empire was gone. But what they were building now? That would be his real legacy. If you've been following Richard, Mara, and Rachel's journey from collapse to redemption, drop a comment about what surprised you most. And if stories about second chances, unlikely partnerships, and fighting for what's right resonate with you, you know what to do. Like this video and subscribe, because some empires deserve to rise again.